She bought one mug. That was the first sign, though she didn't know it was a sign at the time. She'd been in the kitchen section of the home goods store on a Saturday in September, replacing something. A pot, she thought, or maybe a colander. And she'd passed the mug display and stopped. They were nice mugs, the kind with some weight to them, ceramic, a color she liked. She'd been using the same 4 mugs since the marriage, the set she'd been given at a shower. Nice enough, nothing wrong with them. She'd used them through the marriage, and through the divorce, and through the 2 years after, using them every morning the way you use things that are functional and don't require a decision. She picked up one of the new mugs. She held it for a moment. She put it back. She picked it up again. She stood in the home goods store for probably 3 minutes longer than a person should stand considering a mug, and then she bought it. One. Not a set, one mug, because she needed one, and she'd wanted it, and that was enough. She carried it home and washed it and put it in the cabinet, and then stood in her kitchen and looked at the cabinet. She'd bought herself a mug. She didn't know why this made her stand in the kitchen for an extra minute. She did know. She just wasn't ready to say it. If this kind of story, not a drama, just a woman in a kitchen holding a mug on a Saturday in September, lands somewhere familiar, subscribe. We look at real human situations here, the quiet ones, the ones that change you before you notice they're changing you. Her name was Grace Ellison, and she was 43, and she had been, for the past 2 years, very careful with herself. Not unhappy. She wanted to be precise about this. She was not unhappy in any way that could be measured. She had an apartment in Indianapolis that was hers and that she'd made into something good. Not decorated with intention so much as accumulated with it. Things she'd chosen individually over time. A couch she'd debated for 2 weeks. Curtains she'd found at an estate sale and had hemmed herself. Plants on the windowsill that she'd kept alive with a consistency that had surprised her. She had a job she was good at, program coordinator for a nonprofit that worked on adult literacy, work that required her full attention and gave her something back. She had her friend Dana and her colleague Patricia and her sister Rachel in Chicago who called every Sunday. She had a life. She would have told anyone it was a good life. But there was something she'd done after the divorce. Something she'd done so gradually and so quietly that she hadn't noticed doing it, which was to set a ceiling on how good things could be. She lived below the ceiling. Competently, consistently, with genuine care for the people around her. She just didn't let things get too good. She didn't examine this. She'd learned, in the years of the marriage and the year of the ending, that examining things was sometimes more cost than benefit. Better to move through the days with the careful efficiency of a person who knew what things required and provided exactly what was required and didn't go looking for more. The mug was the first thing that had gone looking for more. Or she had gone looking for the mug. She wasn't sure which way to read it. The marriage had been 8 years. She didn't talk about it much, which was its own kind of information. People talked about divorces differently. Some people processed them publicly, making the story available to anyone who asked, and some people treated them like a weather event that had passed and didn't need description. Grace was in the second category. If someone asked, she would say, 8 years. It ended. It was the right decision. She said it in the tone that indicated the topic was available in outline form and unavailable in detail, and most people read the tone correctly and moved on. The outline was true. 8 years, it ended, it was the right decision. The detail that she kept inside the outline, it had not been a dramatic ending. There had been no single event, no revelation, no clear before and after. It had been the slow erosion of something that had once been real and had become, over years, a kind of careful management. 2 people managing each other. 2 people who had started somewhere genuine and had moved, without deciding to, into the performance of a marriage rather than the living of one. Her ex-husband's name was Tom. He was a decent person. She thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about things that should be simpler than they are. The fact that he was a decent person had made it harder in some ways, not easier. There was no one to blame with any conviction. There was just something had been wrong, and they had both been right that it was wrong, and the righting of it had required the ending of it. And the ending had cost both of them more than either had fully predicted. She'd cried for most of the first year. Not at work, not in public. She'd kept herself together in the way she kept herself together in general, which was to say completely, to all appearances. But at home, in the apartment she'd moved into alone for the first time in her adult life, she'd cried in a way that she now thought of as grief rather than sadness, because it was bigger than sadness, because it was for the whole shape of the life she'd thought she was living. In the second year, the crying had stopped, and the careful had begun. She'd built a life that worked. She'd built it the way you build things when you've recently watched something break, with a specific attention to structural integrity, with no excess, with the deliberate removal of anything that might be a liability. She'd chosen her apartment for its distance from anything that reminded her of the marriage. She'd cultivated friendships that were real but not demanding. She'd gotten good at her job in the way you get good at things when work is the thing that doesn't disappoint you. She'd built a life that worked. She just hadn't let herself enjoy it very much. His name was Daniel Park, and she met him at a work event in October. Not a romantic setting, a community benefit, the kind her nonprofit organized every quarter. An evening at a community center with folding tables and food donated by local restaurants, and a lot of people milling around who all worked in adjacent nonprofit sectors and had the specific mix of genuine commitment and mild exhaustion that characterized people in that particular industry. She'd been working the registration table when he'd come to check in. He was there on behalf of his organization. He ran a financial literacy program for recently relocated immigrants, she'd learn later. A small operation, just him and 2 part-time staff, and he'd checked in with the organized politeness of a person who had been to many events like this and didn't find them effortful. They talked briefly at the table. She'd handed him his name tag, and he'd said thank you, and asked how her organization had been doing since the last quarter, and she'd said, well, actually, they'd had a good grant cycle, and he'd said, that was good to hear, genuinely, and she'd thought, that was genuine. Not much, just a brief impression, filed and moved on from. She'd run into him later at the food table. He'd been getting coffee, and she'd been putting away extra programs, and he'd said, are those programs going somewhere, or did you need help? She'd said she was putting them away. He'd said, I'll hold this side while you stack them, it'll be faster. He'd held the stack of programs while she aligned them, and the whole thing took 40 seconds, and he'd said, good luck with the rest of the event, and he'd walked away. She'd stood there for a moment with the programs. She hadn't thought much about it. She'd thought, that was a nice person. She'd moved on. He'd found her again at the end, when she was carrying a folding table to the storage room, and had said, can I get the door? He'd gotten the door. She'd said thank you. He'd said, I'm Daniel. We talked at registration. I know, she said. Grace. I know, he said. Name tag. She'd been wearing her name tag. She'd forgotten. He'd held the storage room door while she maneuvered the table in, and then he'd said, I think a few of us are going to that Thai place around the corner after, if you're still here. You're welcome to join. She'd said she had to get home. Sure, he said. No pressure in it. Just, sure. Good night, Grace. She'd driven home. She'd made tea in the kitchen and sat at the table and thought about the folding table. About someone holding a storage room door while she maneuvered a folding table. About the specific, ordinary decency of that and how it had felt. And why it had felt notable at all. She'd decided it wasn't notable. She'd gone to bed. But she'd thought about it again in the morning, which she noted and then declined to analyze. Dana was her closest friend, the kind of close that didn't require frequency, that could go 2 weeks without contact and pick up exactly where it had been left. They had dinner once a month and texted in the sporadic way of busy people who were thinking of each other more than the texts indicated. Grace told her about the event 2 weeks after. Not immediately. She wasn't sure why not immediately, except that telling Dana immediately would have made it a bigger thing than it was, which she had decided it wasn't. She told her over dinner, between the entree and the dessert they always ordered to split, as though it were something she was mentioning rather than something she'd been sitting with. She described Daniel, the registration table, the programs, the storage room door. She said, "He was just normal. Nice." Dana looked at her. "Did he ask for your number?" "No." "Did you want him to?" Grace looked at the table. "I don't know," she said. "What did you feel when he walked away at the end?" She thought about this honestly. "Like I was watching something leave," she said, "which is a strange way to feel about someone you had a 4-minute conversation with." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Maybe not that strange," she said. "I'm not," Grace started. "I know you're not," Dana said. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying, 4 minutes and you felt something. That's information." "I feel things about the coffee at the new place on 5th, Grace said. "That's also information." "The coffee can't hold the storage room door for you," Dana said. Grace ate a bite of the dessert. "I don't know if I run into him again," she said. "He's in the same sector. Maybe I do. Maybe I don't." "What would you do if you did?" She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "Probably." "Because you didn't like him?" "Because I don't." She stopped. "I'm not ready for that," she said. "Any of that. The whole—" She gestured vaguely at the concept of it. Dana looked at her with the expression she had when she was deciding how much to say. "You said that 2 years ago," she said carefully. Grace looked at her. "I know," Grace said. "I'm not pushing," Dana said. "I know you're not." They sat with the dessert and the restaurant sounds around them, and Grace thought about the storage room door and why she'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and what that meant about where she was. She didn't have a clean answer. She paid her half of the check and drove home and stood in her kitchen for a moment before she turned the lights off and went to bed. The new mug was in the cabinet. She'd been using it every morning. She ran into him in November. A different event, a conference, half-day, the kind of professional gathering that people in the nonprofit sector attended because they should, because the panels were sometimes useful and the networking was at least possible. She'd registered weeks before and had almost canceled twice, and had gone because she'd already registered. He was in the 3rd row when she came in and found a seat in the 5th. He turned around during the break between panels and saw her and said from 3 rows away, "Hi, Grace." She said hi. After the 2nd panel, he made his way over. They stood against the back wall with their conference coffee, which was adequate if you didn't have opinions. He asked about her organization's work. She told him. He asked specific questions, not the polite kind that signal waiting for your turn to talk, the actual kind. The kind that required her to think about her answers. She found herself saying something she'd been thinking about at work but hadn't said to anyone. A thing about the gap between program design and participant need. And he listened and said, "That's a real problem in ours too. We assumed the schedule worked for everyone, and it mostly worked for no one." She said, "What did you do?" He said, "We asked them. Took 3 weeks to restructure. Much better." She said, "We keep meaning to do a participant survey." He said, "Do you want the one we use? I could send it to you. It's nothing sophisticated." She said, "That would actually be helpful." He said, "Email?" He held out his phone, not presumptively as a question. She typed her work email into his contacts. He said, "I'll send it tonight." He did. She sat at her kitchen table that evening and opened his email, which had the survey attached and a single line. "Hope this is useful. Daniel. She opened the survey and read through it, and thought about implementing it, and thought about the conference, and the back wall, and the coffee, and the quality of his questions. And she did not do anything with any of that except take note of it, carefully. The way she took note of things she wasn't ready to do anything with. She emailed back, "This is great, thank you. Going to adapt it for our context." He replied an hour later, "Let me know how it goes." She put her phone down. She thought, "This is fine. This is two people in the same sector exchanging professional resources. This is exactly what networking is. This is nothing." She thought this clearly and precisely and knew it was partly true and partly a ceiling. They had lunch in December. He'd texted her. Her work email had apparently been enough for him to find her professional profile, which had her cell number, and said he'd be near her part of the city for a meeting and was she free for lunch. Nothing formal, just if she happened to be. She'd sat with a text for 20 minutes. She'd told herself, it's lunch. It's two people who work in adjacent sectors having a professional conversation over food. She'd told herself this and known she was telling it to herself and sent back, "Sure, I know a place." Lunch was at a Thai restaurant 3 blocks from her office. He arrived on time. He didn't say anything about being on time, which she noticed because the men she'd known in her life who were punctual tended to mention being punctual. He was just there when she arrived, which was a minute before the time she'd said. They ate. They talked about work for a while, and then about other things. Books, which they had overlapping taste in. A neighborhood in Indianapolis they both liked. Something in the news they had similar opinions on, and then differing opinions on, which he navigated without either ceding too quickly or pushing too hard. She liked talking to him. She noticed this and held it at a slight remove, the way she held most things that had potential weight. Toward the end of lunch, he said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. "You seem like someone who thinks a lot before you decide things," he said. She looked at him. "Not a criticism," he said. "I just noticed, at the conference, you answered every question like you were actually thinking about it." He picked up his water. "I do the same thing. I think it's a thing some people do and other people don't, and when two people who both do it are talking to each other, it's, I don't know, easier." She thought about this. "Easier than what?" she said. "Than talking to people who answer immediately," he said. "Which is usually fine. It's just a different speed." She ate a bite of her food. "I do think a lot before I decide things," she said. "I figured," he said. "Sometimes I overthink them," she said. "Also probably true," he said. She looked at him. "You're very direct," she said. "Is that okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's," she thought about the word, "refreshing." He smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind a face makes when it's actually pleased. She noticed the smile and had a reaction to the smile that she acknowledged and immediately began constructing a ceiling above. He said, "I'd like to do this again sometime, if you want," she said. "As work people or as people," he said. "Either category, both categories." She looked at the table. She thought about all the things she knew about herself right now. She thought about the careful apartment and the ceiling and the 2 years of functional living and the mug she'd bought herself on a Saturday in September. "I'll think about it," she said. He said, "Okay." No pressure, just okay. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and did not think about work for the first 30 minutes, which was unusual for her. The conversation with the older woman happened in January. Her name was Vivian, and she was 66, and she was one of the participants in Grace's organization's advanced literacy program. Not a typical participant, she'd explained when she enrolled. She'd always been able to read fine, but she'd worked her whole adult life and had never read for pleasure. and she'd retired and found the silence of the house too large and had decided to learn how to read differently, for the pleasure of it rather than the use of it. She'd become a regular, coming to the Thursday sessions, and she and Grace had developed the easy familiarity of two people who cross paths consistently and find each other interesting. Grace had stayed late one Thursday to finish something, and Vivian had stayed to return a book, and they'd ended up at the table near the window with coffee from the kitchen and a conversation that started about the book and went somewhere else. It went somewhere else because Grace was thinking about Daniel's text, which had arrived 2 days before and which she hadn't answered, and which was asking if she wanted to see a film that was coming to the Landmark on Friday. A casual text, an easy text to answer. She hadn't answered it. She'd been sitting with not answering it and understanding why she wasn't answering it and not being proud of why she wasn't answering it. She didn't mean to bring this into the conversation with Vivian. She mentioned something, some oblique reference to a decision she was trying to make, and Vivian looked at her with the kind of attention that people develop when they've been in the world long enough to recognize patterns, and said, "What decision?" Grace hadn't meant to tell her. She told her, not in detail, just the outline, a person, a lunch, a question asked, a text she hadn't answered, the general shape of the hesitation. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been divorced?" she said. 2 years, Grace said. "A little over. And before that, the marriage was difficult. Toward the end, yes." Vivian looked at the window. It was January outside, gray, not cold enough to be dramatic, just the flat gray of a Midwest winter that had committed. "I was with someone for 4 years after my first marriage," she said. "This was back in my 30s. A man I genuinely cared about, who was genuinely kind to me." She paused. "I was the one who ended it." Grace looked at her. "I kept waiting for it to go wrong," she said. "He was kind to me, and I kept thinking, the other shoe. I kept looking for the thing underneath the kindness, and when I didn't find it, I thought, I must be missing something. I must not be looking hard enough." She turned her teacup in her hands. "I ended things with a kind man because I couldn't believe the kindness was real, because I decided that my job was to be cautious, to not be fooled again." Grace said, "Were you? Was I right to end it?" Vivian said, "Were you protecting yourself?" Vivian thought about this. "I was being faithful to my pain," she said. "That's what I understand now. I was being very, very faithful to my pain. I decided that my pain was the truest thing about me, and that anyone who wanted me to put it down was asking me to be less honest, less careful." She paused. "I spent a long time thinking that was integrity." "Was it?" Grace said. "It was loneliness," Vivian said. "It was loneliness that I'd convinced myself was a virtue." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the gray January. "I'm not saying your situation is mine," Vivian said. "I don't know this person. I don't know what's right." "I know," Grace said. "I'm just saying—" Vivian stopped. She looked at her tea. "I spent years being very loyal to a version of myself that was protecting against something that had already happened, and I kept being surprised that the protection felt like a cage." She looked at Grace. "Not every kindness is a trick. Sometimes it's just kindness, and you'll never know which it is until you let yourself find out." Grace looked at the table. She thought about Daniel's text, the Landmark on Friday. She thought about the storage room door and the coffee at the conference and the lunch and the way he answered questions, the way he'd said, "as people," without making it a declaration. She thought about the ceiling she'd been maintaining. She thought about what Vivian had said, "Faithful to my pain." She thought about the mug in her cabinet. She drove home and sat at her kitchen table. She picked up her phone. She answered the text. "Drop a comment below. Have you ever been loyal to your pain past the point where it was protecting you? Sometimes just naming it is the thing. We'll be here. She sent, sorry for the delay. The landmark on Friday sounds good. He replied in 4 minutes. Great, 7:15 show? She said yes. She put the phone down and looked at her kitchen. She'd said yes to a film on Friday. That was all she'd done. She'd answered a text that she'd been sitting on for 2 days and said yes to a film, and that was the sum of it. And she was aware that her heart was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do, which was a kind of low-level alarm that she recognized as fear, and also, underneath the fear, something else. She was nervous. She hadn't been nervous about something like this in a long time because she hadn't done anything like this in a long time. She'd been careful. She'd been functional. She'd been adequate to all of life's requirements without reaching for anything that might not reach back. She was nervous. That was information too. She called her sister Rachel on Sunday. Rachel was 3 years older, lived in Chicago, had been married for 16 years to a man Grace liked, had 2 teenage sons who were a source of both pride and exhausted humor. She had the perspective of someone who had watched Grace through the marriage and the ending and the 2 years after, and who had not, in all of that time, said more than Grace was ready to hear. This was Rachel's particular quality. She was opinionated. She had things she thought, and she rationed them with a precision that Grace had always trusted. She told Rachel about Daniel. The whole outline, the event, the conference, the lunch, the text, the film on Friday. Rachel listened all the way through. He sounds normal, she said. That's what I keep thinking, Grace said, that he seems normal. And the problem with normal is? Grace looked at her window, the January light, pale and honest. I don't know how to tell the difference anymore, she said, between normal and just the early part, when things seem good before they stop being good. You think everything that seems good is eventually going to stop? Rachel said. I think I don't know how to trust myself about it, Grace said. My instincts failed me. With Tom, I thought things were fine for years, and they weren't. And now I don't know how to read a situation without thinking I'm wrong. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Tom wasn't a lie, she said. He wasn't hiding something. You two were just wrong for each other after a while. That's not a failure of your instincts. That's just 2 people who changed and didn't change together. I know that, Grace said. But you don't feel it, Rachel said. A pause. I feel like I should have known sooner, Grace said. And because I didn't know sooner, I don't trust myself to know now. Grace, Rachel said, there was nothing to know sooner. You two were good, and then you weren't. There's no version where you caught the problem early. The problem was the ending, not something underneath the beginning. Grace sat with this. I've been treating my marriage like a warning I should have heeded, she said. I know you have, Rachel said. And? And the warning that it's generating, that any new thing could go the same way, it's not a real warning. It's just fear that found an explanation. Rachel's voice was even. You weren't wrong about Tom. You loved him and it ended. Those 2 things are both true, and neither one makes the other false. Grace was quiet. I've been afraid to be happy, she said. I know, Rachel said, because it feels like... She stopped. It feels like if I'm happy, then the pain wasn't that serious. Like being okay means the ending wasn't as big a deal as it was. Being okay doesn't mean the ending wasn't serious, Rachel said. It means you lived through a serious thing and you're still here. She said it simply, not as a declaration, just as a fact. Grace looked at the mug on her counter, the one she'd bought herself in September. She thought about Vivian, faithful to my pain. She thought about the ceiling. She thought about Friday and what she was going to do when she met him at the landmark, whether she was going to do the thing she always did now, maintain a careful pleasantness, keep everything at the surface level, make sure nothing got close enough to cost her anything if it went wrong, or whether she was going to try, for 2 hours, to just be there. Just be there. "I'm going on Friday," she said. "I know you are," Rachel said. "You already said yes." "No," Grace said. "I mean, I'm going to actually go, not the version of going where I'm already halfway gone." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. Friday came. She'd spent 3 days being reasonable about it. She'd told herself it was 2 people at a film, that the film would do most of the work, that she didn't have to arrive with anything prepared, that she could simply show up and see what happened, and trust herself to navigate what happened when it happened. She'd told herself all of this, and she'd still spent 20 minutes getting dressed and changed twice, which she noted with a kind of fond exasperation, the way you're fond of the parts of yourself that are inconvenient. He was waiting outside the landmark when she arrived, 3 minutes before the show. He'd brought nothing, no flowers, which she was glad about because flowers would have been too much, would have told her something about him that she didn't want to know yet. He'd just shown up. "Good timing," he said. "I'm usually a little early," she said. "Me too," he said. He held the door. She went in. They got tickets and popcorn. He asked if she wanted any, and she said yes, and he got a medium and didn't ask if she wanted to share, just put it between them on the armrest in a way that indicated it was available without requiring a decision. She noticed this. She noticed it the way she'd been noticing things about him since October, the specifics of how he moved through the world, the particular quality of his not requiring things from the air around him. The film was good, an independent thing, a drama, the kind of film that was quiet in a way that rewarded patience. She'd been reading to find something to think about during the film, a thing she'd started doing in the 2 years of careful living, preparing commentary for herself, staying a half step removed from whatever was happening. She'd been doing it for so long she'd stopped noticing. She noticed on Friday. She noticed because about 40 minutes in, she stopped doing it. She didn't decide to stop. She just looked at the screen and was there, watching the film, not thinking about what she thought about the film, not managing the experience, just in it. And she was aware, in the way that you become aware of things when they're suddenly different, that this had not been happening for 2 years, that she had been a half step removed from everything, the job, the friendships, the good coffee, the plants on the windowsill. There, but not all the way there. She was all the way there on Friday, watching a film at the landmark in January, with a paper bag of popcorn on the armrest. She almost laughed. In the middle of a quiet scene in the film, she almost laughed because the thing that had finally gotten her all the way into a room was popcorn in a paper bag. She contained the laugh. She ate a piece of popcorn. Afterward, they stood on the sidewalk in the January cold and talked about the film. He'd liked it. She'd liked it. They had slightly different responses to the ending, which produced a real conversation, the kind where neither person deferred too quickly and neither person pushed too hard. He said, "I think he was wrong to go back." She said, "I think he was right, but he went back for the wrong reason." He thought about this and said, "That's better than what I said." She looked at him. "Do you want to get tea or something?" she said. She said it and knew she'd said it before she'd finished deciding to say it, which was itself information. He said, "Yes." They went to the coffee shop 2 blocks from the theater, the one with the good light and the tables that were the right size for a real conversation. She had tea, he had coffee. They sat across from each other in the good light. They talked for 2 hours. She didn't keep track of all of it. She wasn't managing the conversation, and she wasn't pre-preparing her responses, and she wasn't monitoring how she was doing, which was the version of herself she'd been bringing to most social situations for 2 years. She was just talking to him, and he was just talking to her, and the 2 hours went the way 2 hours go when you're not watching them. He said at some point, "Can I ask you something?" "You can tell me, it's none of my business." She said, "Okay." He said, You have a quality that's hard to describe, like you're considering whether to be here." She looked at him. "I'm here," she said. "Tonight you are," he said. "More than the other times we've talked. But some of those times you were, half somewhere else." He said it without criticism, just as an observation, clearly, the way he said things. I noticed because I've done the same thing. She looked at her tea. "I was in a long marriage," she said. "It ended about 2 years ago. She stopped. "I've been careful." He looked at her. "The careful is visible," he said. "That's all I'm saying. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I just wanted to name it so it wasn't something we were both pretending not to see." She thought about Vivian. "Faithful to my pain." She thought about Rachel. "You lived through a serious thing, and you're still here." "I've been afraid to let things be good," she said. She said it plainly, to the table, and then looked up at him. "Because of the marriage?" he said. "Because of what it meant that the marriage ended," she said. "Because I decided that being careful was the same as being honest, that if I was happy it meant I was overlooking something." She paused. "That the pain was, I was being loyal to it." He was quiet. "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" "I was in something that ended badly about 3 years ago," he said. "I spent a long time after, not quite," he considered, "not quite believing that good things were real, waiting for the translation." He looked at his coffee. "Everything nice that happened to me, I was already working out what it was actually saying underneath." "The translation," she said. "What does this nice thing really mean?" he said. "What is it about to cost me?" He looked up. "It's exhausting." "Yes," she said. "And it's not actually caution," he said. "It's just being mean to yourself in advance." She looked at him. That was so precisely what it was. She'd spent 2 years being mean to herself in advance, punishing herself for potential future harm that hadn't arrived, that might not arrive, that she had no actual reason to expect. She'd taken the pain of the marriage ending and had installed it as a permanent condition, a permanent weather, and called it wisdom. It was not wisdom. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah." "I don't know what this is," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not assuming anything." "I know," he said. "But I'm glad I answered the text," she said. "That's all. I'm glad I answered it." He looked at her with the expression she'd been trying not to notice he sometimes had. The specific quality of his attention, which was complete without being pressuring, which was present without requiring anything. "Me too," he said. She drove home. She parked in her spot and sat in the car for a minute with the January dark around her and the heat still running, and thought about the evening. Not analyzed, not managed, just held. The way you hold something briefly, before you put it down somewhere it'll keep. She thought about the 2 hours in the coffee shop. She thought about the film and the popcorn and the sidewalk and the ending they'd disagreed about. She thought about the translation, being mean to yourself in advance. She thought about the ceiling she'd been maintaining. She thought about what it had cost. Not him. She wasn't thinking about him as a solution, wasn't thinking about this as the answer to anything. She was thinking about the ceiling itself, the specific act of capping how good things were allowed to be, the daily maintenance of it, the energy required to hold a thing down. She thought about the mug. She thought about the first morning she'd used it, had picked it up and put it in her hand and drunk her coffee out of something she'd bought because she'd wanted it, and how that had felt, and how small it had seemed, and how it had been the beginning of something she hadn't known was beginning. She went inside. She turned on the light in the kitchen. She filled the kettle and put it on and got the mug from the cabinet, the good one, the ceramic one with the weight to it, and stood at the counter. She thought about what she wanted. This was the question she'd been not asking for 2 years. She'd been asking, what do I need to do? What do I need to manage? What is required of me today? She hadn't been asking what she wanted, because wanting things felt like the precursor to losing things, and she hadn't wanted to go through that again. She stood in her kitchen and asked herself what she wanted. She wanted to see the film they'd argued about again, alone, to see if she still thought what she thought about the ending. She wanted to call her sister more than once a week. She wanted to buy more plants. She'd been limiting herself to the windowsill, but there was a corner of the living room that had been empty since she moved in, and she'd always thought a plant would be good there. She wanted to finish the novel on her nightstand, which she'd been reading in 15-minute increments before bed, carefully, like a dessert she was rationing. She wanted, possibly, to go somewhere this spring. Somewhere she hadn't been. She'd looked at train routes once and closed the tab. She wanted to see what happened with Daniel. She wrote none of this down. It didn't need to be written down. It just needed to be acknowledged, plainly, without the ceiling. The kettle boiled. She made her tea. She carried it to the couch, the good couch she'd spent 2 weeks choosing, and she sat in her living room in the January dark and drank it slowly and didn't do anything else for a while. Just that. Tea in her own apartment in the quiet of a Friday night, after a film and a conversation and a drive home, with the specific feeling of someone who has been carrying something for 2 years and has, tonight, very slightly put it down. Not solved, not resolved, just slightly put down. It was enough for a Friday. She texted Dana on Saturday morning. She said, "Went to the film last night." Dana replied in 2 minutes. "And?" She said, "And I was actually there. The whole time, not halfway there." Dana sent back a string of things that expressed enthusiasm without requiring Grace to respond to each one individually, which was one of the things she loved about Dana. She put her phone down and made breakfast. She made it the way she'd been making it since the divorce. Functional, correct, everything she needed. And then she thought about a thing she'd seen once at a restaurant. A specific way of doing eggs with a particular herb she had in her fridge, and she did that instead. The eggs were good. She ate them at the table with the mug and the Saturday morning coming through the kitchen window, and thought about what Vivian had said. Faithful to my pain. She thought about what Faith to Pain had produced. 2 years of competent, careful, ceilinged living. Not a bad life, but a managed one. A life spent mostly waiting for the other shoe. The other shoe had not dropped. The other shoe was possibly just a shoe. She thought about Daniel and the translation and the being mean to yourself in advance. She thought about 2 people who'd both learned the same bad habit and were both, apparently, working on unlearning it. She didn't know what would come of it. She was genuinely uncertain, not the artificial uncertainty of a person who is protecting themselves from knowing what they know, but the real uncertainty of someone at a beginning who can't see the end yet and has decided, for the first time in 2 years, that this is not a reason to avoid the beginning. Beginnings were uncertain. Endings were uncertain. That was the whole situation, had always been the whole situation, and she'd been behaving as though caution could remove the uncertainty when all it had done was remove the living. She couldn't protect herself from potential pain in advance. What she could do was be there. She got up and did the dishes. She watered the plants on the windowsill. She looked at the empty corner of the living room and thought about the plant she'd been meaning to get. She picked up her keys. The plant she bought was a fiddle-leaf fig. The woman at the nursery said it would need good light and consistency and would be dramatic about changes in its environment for the first few months. Grace said that sounded familiar. The woman laughed and said they all came around eventually. She drove home with the fiddly fig in the back seat and the January light coming through the car windows, and thought about the empty corner in the living room, and the mug in the cabinet, and the journal she'd been meaning to start, and the train routes she'd looked at and closed. She thought about Vivian, who had been faithful to her pain for too long and had lost a kind man to the faithfulness. She thought about what Vivian had said at the end of their conversation as they were putting on their coats. "I'm not suggesting you rush anything. I'm not suggesting you should feel things you don't feel. I'm just saying." She'd stopped and looked at Grace with the particular directness of a woman who had learned things the long way. "Don't be so loyal to the past that you miss the present. That's all. Just be present for it." Present for it. She carried the fiddly fig up the stairs and into the apartment and set it in the corner of the living room. She stepped back. The corner was no longer empty. It was not a large change. It was a plant in a corner. It was one specific thing in one specific place that was evidence of a decision to stop maintaining the empty corner as though the empty corner were a principled position. She took a picture of it. She texted it to Rachel with no caption. Rachel responded, "I'm crying." And then, "This is the plant conversation I've been waiting to have with you for 2 years." Grace sent back a laughing face and put her phone down. She emailed Daniel on Sunday. Not a long email, just, "I've been thinking about what you said, about being mean to yourself in advance. I've been doing that for 2 years, and I didn't have a name for it until you said it. Thank you for naming it." He replied that evening, "I've been doing it too, still working on it." She said, "Same." He said, "There's a talk at the library next Saturday, urban farming, but it's actually interesting. The presenter knows what they're doing. Would you want to go?" She sat with the question for 90 seconds. She thought about the ceiling. She said, "Yes." He said, "Great, I'll send the details." She put her phone down. She sat in her living room with the fiddle leaf fig in the corner and the mug on the coffee table and the novel on the side table, the one she'd been reading in 15-minute increments. She picked it up. She read for an hour. Not in increments, just read, unrationed, the way you read when you've decided to be present for it. The novel was good. She'd known it was going to be good. She'd known since page 30 and had been managing the knowing, parceling it out, not wanting it to end and so not letting it go fast enough to actually enjoy. She was still learning that the things that ended didn't lose what they'd been. The marriage had ended. It had also been 8 years of something real. Both of those things were true, and neither one canceled the other. The ending didn't reach back and erase what had been good, and the good that had been good didn't mean the ending hadn't been necessary. Both things. She sat on her couch and read her novel and drank her tea in the good mug and thought about both things coexisting and found that she could hold them. Not easily. She wasn't going to say easily, but she could hold them. She read until 10 and went to bed. In the morning, she used the mug again, the ceramic one, the weight of it, and stood in her kitchen with the coffee and looked at the Saturday light coming in and thought about the library next weekend and the fiddly fig in the corner and the train routes she'd closed and was going to open again. She thought about Vivian's sentence, "Be present for it." She thought about what present looked like. It looked like this, she thought. Coffee in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, actually in it, not managing it from a half-step back. The fiddle leaf fig needing water. The novel unfinished on the table. The uncertain, unmanaged, genuinely open question of what would come of the library and the talk and the person who had named a thing she'd been doing and who was, apparently, trying to stop doing it too. She didn't know what would come of it. She had decided that not knowing was acceptable. She had decided, which was a thing she hadn't known she was deciding until she found herself on the other side of it, that she was allowed to be here. In this apartment, in this life, in the present moment that had no guarantee attached to it. She was allowed to be happy, not as a reward, not as evidence that the pain hadn't been real, not as a conclusion to a story where everything worked out. Just allowed, available to it, present for it when it arrived. That was the whole thing. It was smaller than she'd expected, and it was also, standing in her kitchen on a Sunday morning with coffee and the fiddle-leaf fig waiting to be watered, everything. She put the mug down. She watered the plant. She got on with her day. If this story reached you, not the romance, but the part about the ceiling, the faithful to the pain part, the half-step removed part, leave a word in the comments. You don't have to explain it. Sometimes just saying, "I recognize that," is enough. We'll be here.